Hey everybody, I'm reading a piece today by Frank Engster. It's from Marx Key Concepts, edited by Riccardo Bellofiore and Tommaso Rodolfi Riva. Trying to find a little bio on Frank Engster. Maybe I can. Let's see. Maybe it's in the book. Okay, it says Frank Engster, Berlin, wrote his Ph.D. thesis Das Geld als Maß, Mittel und Methode, das Rechnen mit der Identität der Zeit, in 2014 on the subject of time, money, and measure. Engster is interested in the different post-operaist, post-structuralist, form-analytic, queer feminist, and so on readings of Marx's critique, especially money as a technique, and its connection with measurement, quantification, time, and natural science. Some of his publications are published on academia.edu. Alright, so here we go. Section 1 is titled Marx's Capital as Capital Theory of Money, Value, and Their Common Valorization. One way to read Marx's Capital is to read it as a theory and critique of money. Footnote. In Capital, Marx's concept of money differs radically from all previous conceptions, even from the so-called Grundrisse. In the various editions of Capital Volume 1, he not only sets out the final three versions of his value form analysis, but he now also distinguishes between value and exchange value. He replaces, quote, common labor, end quote, with, quote, abstract labor, end quote. He clearly indicates the double character of labor and of the commodity, and he underlines the particularity of the commodity labor power, and so on. End footnote. Volume 1 can be read along with the logical categorical development of its main functions, a development that in the Hegelian sense is a, quote, retreat to the ground, end quote, and accounting for presuppositions. Here, the capitalist ground of money is developed through the attainment of its capital form through the valorization of labor and capital. Volume 2 then explains the reproduction circuits accomplished by money. Finally, Volume 3 deals with the manifestation of valorization in prices, with money's finance forms such as credit money and fictitious capital with capitalist crises. It is crucial to note that throughout the whole development, money's functions are always inseparably combined with value, that is, with the social relation which money, 1, realizes and quantifies qua measure, 2, mediates and transfers qua means of exchange and circulation, and 3, brings into effect and expands through its finance capital form. In all three dimensions, not only is money combined, or rather, to use a suitable term from quantum physics, entangled, with value, but also the entanglement takes on a form. Wikipedia says, an entangled system is defined to be one whose quantum state cannot be factored as a product of states of its local constituents. That is to say, they are not individual particles, but are an inseparable whole. Back to the text. By developing these forms, Marx shows how money receives money's functions and, quote, properties, end quote, through the social relations which money determines and constitutes, realizes and transfers, valorizes and expands. Capital Volume 1 begins with the value form analysis, which exposits the measure of value. The exposition then shows that this measure becomes practical in money's function as means of exchange and circulation and takes on the form of simple commodity circulation, commodity money commodity, CMC, before finally generating the overarching capital form of money, money commodity more money, MCM prime. Through this exposition, capital demonstrates that the value realization in commodities comes from the valorization of labor and capital, and that realized profit comes from unpaid labor time. These three steps are finally the condition to reason that the form of finance capital, money, money prime, money, more money, is an abbreviated yet, quote, irrational, end quote, form. Marx, as the form of finance capital, money, more money, depends on this productive valorization and on the exploitation of labor power, and it seems to generate profit without productive valorization and without the exploitation of labor power. So footnote that I missed. The logical reading of capital in general and of the value form analysis in particular was established in the 1960s in opposition to the existing logical historical reading, which was even propagated by Engels. This dominant reading was first challenged by Isaac Illich Rubin's 1928 essays on Marx's theory of value, and from the mid-1960s by Roman Rozdowski, Jędrek Zelny, and the different new workerist structuralist form analytic readings of capital. What was I going to say? For a critique, a very concise and simple critique of this logical historical method, I would recommend like the early chapters of Michael Heinrich's Introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital, but also the piece that I have, which is on this channel. But there's another piece I have on this channel that's by Christopher J. Arthur. It might just be C.J. Arthur or Chris Arthur in the how it's labeled, but it's titled "The Myth of Simple Commodity Production." And his dispute there isn't that like there's no such thing that you could say was simple, no such thing as simple commodity production. What he's saying there is that within Marx's systematic framing of the commodity and the necessity of value becoming to be expressed in money, he's not positing a sort of like a gloss over an actual historical development. That's not what he's doing, right? So like he's not saying that once upon a time there was barter, and then there was this, and then this happened, and then this happened. No, he's trying to demonstrate logically, at least from my understanding of what Arthur was saying. Maybe I'm misrepresenting him, so don't quote me on it. But he's saying that like it seems to be what the point of that third section of Volume 1, Chapter 1 of Capital is about establishing the necessity of value being expressed in a general equivalent, a money form. Not saying that like whereas Engels put forward this idea that what Marx was saying was giving like a rough logical overview of like a development from barter, simple commodity production to capital. I have Zelensky's book. I'm not sure if I have. I haven't read it though. I should read it. That's enough out of me. Where the hell was I? Section 6.2 or section 2. This chapter is chapter 6, so it's just section 2. The critical outcome of the logical categorical reading of capital. It was the decisive insight of the, quote, logical reading, end quote, developed in the 1960s, especially by the so-called new reading of Marx, that Marx's analysis of the form X commodity A equals Y commodity B at the very beginning of capital should not be interpreted as an exchange, whether in the sense of a historical reconstruction or in that of a logical systemic genesis. A couple footnotes here. Pioneers were Hans-Georg Bachhaus and Helmut Reichelt. Working groups around the student movement in West Germany, and research groups in East Germany, especially in a circle around the Halle-based Arbeitsblätter zur Marx-Engels-Forschung. It says that Halle-based group Arbeitsblätter zur Marx-Engels-Forschung, which is Wolfgang Jan Marxhausen and Rolf Hecker, I think is the name. It's R. Hecker, but I think it's Rolf is his name. So look at some of these people real quick. Wolfgang Jan, this is from the German Wikipedia, was an economist, a German Marxist economist, and Marx-Engels researcher. Wolfgang Jan was a professor and vice editor for social sciences at the Martin Luther University of Halle, and for many years a member of the executive board of the Scientific Council for Marx-Engels Research in the GDR. He gained international fame primarily through his extensive research into the economic legacy of Karl Marx and through his work on the Marx-Engels Complete Edition. Fuck it, I'm going to read more of his stuff, more of his biography. Because you hear this name, you'll hear Wolfgang Jan mentioned, and I want to know, like in other things. Born into a working-class family, Wolfgang Jan attended elementary and middle school in Erfurt from 1928 to 1937. He then completed a commercial apprenticeship. In 1941, he was called up for military service in the Wehrmacht and was an American prisoner of war from 1944 to 1947. After his release, Wolfgang Jan took the special school-leaving examination in 1947, studied social sciences with a focus on political economy at the Friedrich Schiller University in Jena until 1950 and graduated with a degree in economics. In 1956, he received his doctorate from the Humboldt University in Berlin with a dissertation on the beginning of economic studies by the young Karl Marx. In 1965, Wolfgang Jan qualified as a professor at the University of Rostock. In 1951, Wolfgang Jan was appointed lecturer in political economy at the Humboldt University in Berlin. From 1954 until the summer of 1987, Wolfgang Jan worked at the Martin Luther University in Halle, where he served as vice-rector for social sciences from 1954 to 1964, as director of the Marxism-Leninism section from 1965 to 1970. In 1957, he was appointed professor for the foundations of political economy, and his retirement followed in 1987. Wolfgang Jan was a member of the management of the Scientific Council for Marx-Engels Research in the GDR for many years. In 1974, Wolfgang Jan was awarded the Karl Marx Order. The Karl Marx Order, founded in 1953, was the most important and highly endowed award of the GDR. His private life, it says, Wolfgang Jan was married to Gertrude Jan and had 3 daughters. His father, Hermann Jan, was an anti-fascist resistance fighter, German communist politician, and shortly before his death, mayor of the city of Erfurt for a few months. His brother Günther Jan was a German SED functionary, member of the Central Committee of the SED, and member of the People's Chamber of the GDR, as well as first secretary of the Central Council of the FDJ, which is the Free German Youth, a communist youth organization. From 1970 to 1987, Wolfgang Jan headed the Marx-Engels Research Group at the Martin Luther University in Halle. On behalf of the Berlin Institute for Marxism-Leninism at the Central Committee of the SED, the Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, the second mega, not 2 volumes is in 2 different volumes, but the mega 2, one thing, and multiple volumes. He edited. Looks like he was responsible. He had the leadership of 4 volumes. Jan contributed other volumes of the 2 and 4 departments of the Mega too. Together with other colleagues from the Martin Luther University, Wolfgang Jan published works each of Marx Engels research, 23 issues, and 1 special issue from 1976 to 1988. Wolfgang Jan himself supervised around 50 dissertations on topics related to Marx Engels research. A further 40 diploma theses and 10 B dissertations were written within the research group. Jan became known beyond the GDR with his work Marx's Theory of Value and Surplus Value in the Distorted Mirror of Bourgeois Economists in Berlin, 1968. His introduction to Karl Marx's Das Kapital Volume 1, which has been published in 3 editions since 1983, became popular. Ernst Theodor Moll, who's another important person, but I'm not going to read his thing right now because he's not immediately being mentioned, but if he does become mentioned, I will read his thing. Believe the, quote, secret capital, end quote, of GDR Marx Engels research, with a focus on the, quote, history of Marx's capital, end quote, is Halle. The secret capital being not like money capital, but like a capital isn't like a city. Well, Vitaly Vygotsky was influential in research into Marx's economic legacy in the Soviet Union from the 1960s to the 1980s. Wolfgang Jan was in the GDR. Vygotsky himself speaks of a, quote, school of scientists, end quote, in the MegaTwo environment that goes back to Jan, and he emphasizes his merit in having recognized the importance of Marx's excerpts for the development of the critique of political economy. Of particular importance to Jan were the 24, quote, London notebooks of 1850 to 53, since in Jan's opinion they form the prehistory of the 6-part plan of the critique of political economy. Presented to the public by Marx in 1959. Sorry. Oh, no, there's like a weird thing here. Never mind. In 1978, Wolfgang Jan opened a discussion on the 6-part plan of development with a key article in the Marx Engels Yearbook 1. In doing so, Wolfgang Jan referred to contributions by Henrik Grossmann and Roman Rozdalski. Wolfgang Jan received support from Albert Kogan and Vitaly Vygotsky. As a result of the discussion, by the end of the 1980s, the MegaTwo edition had taken the position that Marx's plan of development from 1859 remained valid for the entire work. This view is also the consensus in the research group in Halle. A preliminary climax of this research was to be a monograph on the 6-part plan of development planned for 1992. With the participation of 9 members, including Wolfgang Jan of the group, it was possible to deal with its core issues. However, this did not happen, as all members were wound up and dismissed by the summer of 1991. So that's Wolfgang Jan. One second. The other important person was Thomas Marxhausen, who lived from 1947 to 2010 in Halle, was a German professor of political economy, author of numerous writings on Marxist economics, history, and contemporary research, employee of the Marx Engels Complete Edition, Mega, and the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism, HKWM, and a long-standing board member of the Berlin Institute for Critical Theory, EV. I don't want to read his whole thing. I don't want to read his life. For the HKWM, Marxhausen wrote articles on topics such as ivory tower development with Sven Erik Liedman and Wolfgang Fritz Haug, extra profit with Neil Saatliegen, quote, factory legislation, quote, fetish character of the commodity, quote, functionary with Gunter Willing, secret diplomacy, quote, secret, quote, fair wages with Gilles Campagnolo, Glasnost with Boris Kagarlitsky, historical mission of the working class, historical school of economics with Mario Candeias, Jacobinism, or that's the Jacobin, which is, I guess, is a bad translation of Jacobins. Capital Edition, Classical Political Economy, Kautskyism, Communist Manifesto, Consumption, Collectivization 2, with Simon Krissel. He also did extensive work as editor and reviewer. In 2008, in the series of philosophical conversations of the Berlin Association of Political Education, Helapanka, he represented the brochure. He made suggestions to mark Brecht's 110th birthday. What has come of it? A summary of his tireless research into Brecht in 2009 under the title Stalin, Stalinisms, a text summarizing many years of work on the socialism debate. There are also countless other conferences and journal contributions. It says Marxhausen's research focuses were alienation of labor, commodity fetishism, ideology critique, history of theory, classical economics, dissolution of economic classicism, vulgar economics and the reception of Marx, methodology, interaction of Marx's economic theory with the history of theory, Brecht's reception of Marxism. Quote, he was always concerned with the whole thing, understanding Marx's theory historically, making use of Brecht's thinking and criticizing, quote, real, end quote, socialism. He claimed for himself, quote, criticism as a way of life, end quote, and as he titled an essay in 1985 about Brecht, end quote. Rolf Hecker. So yeah, I was right. It was Rolf. Marxhausen had early on committed himself to Brecht's, quote, interventionist thinking, end quote, often argued with Heiner Müller and Bulgakov and Hejik, Benjamin and Lukács, and was convincing through his problem orientation. The fact that he was, quote, only, end quote, allowed to travel to Moscow for his research during his teaching career in the GDR, but not to capitalist countries, had to do with his independence, which was interpreted as, quote, political unreliability, end quote. For example, Brecht sent article manuscripts without coordination to the, quote, Marxist Blätter, published in West Germany. In 2008, Thomas Marxhausen ended his work on the HKWM editorial team. He no longer saw it as a format in which he felt at home with his way of looking at things and discussing them. In 2008, Marxhausen wrote in Neues Deutschland, quote, the, quote, good sides, end quote, of the GDR were not possible without its, quote, bad, end quote, sides. A secure job required a cadre file accessible to security. The housing construction program left the old towns to decay. Loving nursery aunts organized disciplinary, quote, potting, end quote, ... The, quote, transfiguration, end quote, of the GDR is fundamentally a reaction to a loss of touch with reality. Demanding social security by referring to earlier, quote, achievements, end quote, does not get us very far. What was an organic part of another society cannot be taken out and transplanted into what already exists. Bourgeois society claims to be a haven of freedom, democracy, human rights, and equal opportunities. Let us take them at their word, end quote. Marxhausen's intensive study of Stalin, Stalinism, and Stalinists culminated in the eponymous text in 2009, which represented a meticulous examination of the structural background of the Bolshevik disaster at a high scientific level. That's interesting. Yeah, I'm very interested in, I'd like to see more people who are like kind of like operating in this kind of like, I don't know, maybe this isn't like, who kind of like take like the cutting edge of like Marxology and try to work those concepts into an understanding of the Soviet Union. Which is difficult because like a lot of the training, I mean maybe it's not as difficult as I'm making it out to be, but I assume a lot of people who work in this new tradition are like philosophers, and often philosophers, maybe sociologists or like economists. So like doing like an actual like, I don't know, application of Marxian categories or like the applicability of Marxian categories or like just like basic features of like say like the new Marx reading to the Soviet Union would be difficult insofar as it would require a lot of historical, a good degree of historical research that perhaps some might not be as good as trained as others. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm over exaggerating. Finally, Rolf Hecker is a German economist and editor. Rolf Hecker was involved in the publication of the Marx Engels Complete Edition. Where am I? I'm gonna look at his writings. I don't really see it. There's usually like in a lot of these German things, there's like a thing about his work, but I'm not really finding that here. It says his independent writings, the development of the theory of value in the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63, a contribution to the critique of political economy and in Capital by Karl Marx. That's his diploma thesis from 1977. Side note, I don't have anything from this volume, which is like the 1861 to 63 volumes are what came to be Kautsky extracted the theories of surplus value from. But they have a piece that's like a review of a book that's an overview of the economic manuscripts of 1861 to 63 by Chris Arthur, critiquing Enrique Dussel on the channel. Other works by Rolf Hecker: The Formation and Development of the Theory of Value in the Works of Karl Marx, Dissertation for Degree of Candidate of Economic Sciences in Russia, Lomonosov's Moscow State University. The next is The Development of the Theory of Value in the Economic Manuscript, Critique of Political Economy from 1861 to 63, and in the first volume of Capital by Karl Marx, The Significance of the Third German Edition of the first volume of Capital from 1883, and the History of the Development of Political Economy and the German Workers' Movement. Marx is a thinker. New research results on his work and biography since 1990 on the 125th anniversary of his death, published in 2008. And one called Spring Points, Contribution to Marx's Research and Capital Discussion. And it looks like he's edited a lot of shit. He's edited, you're seeing some names pop out here that are familiar with people. Heinrich, Schulze, so on. So, it says that Rolf Hecker was a co-founder of the Berlin Association for the Promotion of the Mega Edition, EV, I don't know what that means, and has been its honorary chairman since 1997, together with Richard Sperl and Karl Erich Vollgraff. Rolf Hecker has been the editor of Contributions to Marx Engels Research since 1991, new series in which Marx Engels researchers from various countries publish their research results and discussion contributions, with the volumes of documents he edited on Ryazanov and the First Mega, on the collaboration between the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research and the Moscow Institute, on the end of the Mega by Stalin, on Isaac Ilyich Rubin, and on the Russian and German Marx Engels editions 1945 to 1968. Rolf Hecker has edited important documents on the history of Marx Engels research for the first time. After a brief period of unemployment, Rolf Hecker worked at the quote Mega office end quote at the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Sciences from 1992 to 1995. From 1991 to 1997, Rolf Hecker was a member of the editorial board of the Historical Critical Dictionary of Marxism. Hecker is a member of the Scientific Advisory Board of the journal, quote, International Critical Thought, end quote, of the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and has been a member of the Leibniz Society of Sciences in Berlin since 2007. On the 14th/15th of June 2013, the Berlin Mega Association honored Rolf Hecker with a colloquium, at which Martin Hunt gave the laudation. Since 2017, Rolf Hecker has been a visiting professor at Renmin University in Beijing. Rolf Hecker lives with his wife in Berlin and has 2 sons. So, thanks for listening to all those biographies, but see these names a million times and I knew nothing about them. So, end footnote. Let me get back to the thing I was reading. So, Section 2, the critical outcome of the logical categorical reading of capital. It was the decisive insight of the, quote, logical reading, end quote, developed in the 1960s, especially by the so-called New Marx reading, that Marx's analysis of the form X commodity A equals Y commodity B at the very beginning of Capital should not be interpreted as an exchange, whether in the sense of a historical reconstruction or in that of a logical systematic genesis. Footnote: the necessity of reading of the logical reading of Capital is an outcome not only of discussions of how to read Capital, but of how to begin a critique of the mode of production if it has to be presented as a totality which reproduces itself. End footnote. Instead, the analysis logically shows the necessity of money by the failure of a direct pre-monetary exchange of commodities. The status of a commodity already presupposes money, and therefore cannot be derived from direct commodity exchange. The value form analysis rather has to be read as a critique of all pre-monetary value theories. See Bachhaus, 1980, The value form analysis has to be read as a critique of all pre-monetary value theories and as a, quote, monetary theory of value, end quote. See Bachhaus, 1980, and Heinrich, 2021. There's a lot of people here. But it says, a footnote says, a proper monetary theory of value influenced by the logical reading was elaborated in the works of Hans-Georg Bachhaus and Helmut Reichelt, Etienne Balibar. I'm probably going to read something by Balibar this summer. Diethard Behrens. Sorry, I'm just seeing if there's anything here that's liable to look at. Alright, sorry. Okay. Ricardo Bellofiore. I think it's Helmut Brentel. Okay, so nothing there. Susan de Brunhoff, Ingo Elba, Roberto Fineschi, A. Hessler, Jan Hoff. I really recommend Jan Hoff's Marx Worldwide. Ulrich Krause. I think they have a book with Verso. John Milios, he's like a Greek value form guy. Fred Mosley, who's like one of the first people whose stuff on Marx's Critique of Political Economy I read. H.J. Lenger, Oliver Schlaut. Oliver Schlaut has a really good book that I read a while ago. I think he wrote with Ingo Elba the piece on Alfred Sohn Rethel in the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt Soul Critical Theory. and I think he wrote a book that's like a critical introduction to the philosophy of economics, which is really good, and I should probably read again. I think it was translated by Adrian Wilding. I think that's their name. Who like has some things with open Marxism. G. Segro, H. Strauss, A. Zipansky, and others. I could look all these people up, but then I'd just be here reading this thing forever. I didn't think it would. So I'm sorry if I'm skipping over that, or you're welcome if I'm skipping over that. Back to the text and footnote. This decisive insight gets lost, however, and the whole further development of the capitalist mode of production goes in the wrong direction when money is subsequently once again reconstructed as a means of commodity exchange. Footnote. Historically, there has never been anything like a direct exchange of goods or barter carried out by two individual owners from which money could originate, whether logically or historically. This myth, the Robinsonade with two Robinsons, was first deconstructed in the 1920s by ethnologists such as Marcel Mauss and B. Lam and W. Gerloff. So Marcel Mauss, I think, is... No. Yeah, I'm not finding anything here. Anyway, end footnote. To be analyzed regardless of what Marx himself intended to show, but as it is quite obviously that in the quote X and quote Y is how the quantification of a social relation is possible. This quantitative status is decisive for the whole capitalist mode of production, since it is an economy based not on exchange but on the realization, mediation, and productive valorization, and accumulation of quantitative values, and in cases of crisis, also on their devalorization and annihilation. In capitalism, it is also due to their quantitative status that labor and the commodity become what Marx calls the quote substance and quote form of value end quote respectively, while Marx determines value itself as an undetermined pure quote social relation end quote. It is only by sublating this social relation quantitatively that both labor and the commodity determine society in a double sense, namely by labor and the commodity's famous quote twofold character end quote, which Marx exposes right at the beginning of Capital, the quote dual character of labor embodied in the commodities end quote, and hence the dual character of the commodity itself. Both labor and the commodity can be infinitely different quantitatively, and they can even be infinitely differentiated and developed. This is not in spite of, but precisely due to the circumstance that it is the relation of all individual labors and the relation of all commodities that becomes their identical quality by being determined quantitatively. Marx's Capital further shows that the whole, quote, capitalist production process is a unity of the labor process and the valorization process, end quote. Marx. Hence, wealth in capitalism has a dual character in that wealth in capitalism's qualitative dimension is an infinite multiplicity of possible use values, while wealth in capitalism's quantitative dimension is never finite, but endlessly self-referential, quote, accumulation for accumulation's sake, end quote. Marx. So I just passed over the footnote that I was reading before about like, never mind. To capture this double determination, which is as divisive in the economy as it is thoroughgoing, in one inconspicuous term, the whole capitalist economy is qualitative reproduction as quantitative valorization and accumulation. Therefore, real wealth is neither the capitalist economy's qualitative nor its quantitative dimension. Neither material reproduction nor quantitative accumulation. Real wealth is the mode of their mutual production hidden in the inconspicuous term, quote, as, end quote, which nevertheless stands for nothing less than a speculative identity, the transformation of the qualitative into the quantitative dimension and vice versa. The transformation is what money as a measure accomplishes. This transformation is what money as a measure accomplishes. Through this transformation, the measure itself changes its function and becomes the means to realize the speculative identity between the qualitative and quantitative dimension of the economy. But Marx finally demonstrates that this realization is a moment of money's own, quote, turnover, end quote, as capital, and that is the latter which becomes the form of the processing of the qualitative reproduction of the capitalist society as quantitative magnitudes. Section 3. Quantification as a technique of measurement. It is important to emphasize that in capitalism, money constitutes value as a social relation into which, quote, not an atom of matter enters, end quote, Marx. A similar formulation occurs on page 48 of Capital, and that this relation is hence pure in the non-empirical Kantian sense. According to Marx, however, this purity belongs to a purely, and here, quote, purely, end quote, can rather be linked to Hegel's notion of, quote, pure being, end quote, in his Science of Logic. Quote, social being, end quote, or a purely, quote, social relation, end quote. This purely social relation, with labor as its substance and the commodity as its form, is constituted not simply by quantification, but by quantification through measurement. Quantification through measurement is something totally different from the way in which quantification has been conceptualized in the few attempts which have thus far been made to theorize it using Marx's critique of political economy, and different from how money might have quantified social relations before capitalism. What was overlooked in these attempts, and what Marx himself overlooked or underestimated, but also prepared the way for theoretically, is the constitutive status of money. By quantifying through measurement, money paradoxically constitutes the same quality, the purely social relation, quote, value, end quote, which it simultaneously actualizes objectively and represents. This paradoxical status has to be emphasized against all essentialist and substantialist conceptions of value and abstract labor, especially in the tradition of classical Marxism, which entered Marx's Capital as a, quote, labor theory of value, end quote, but also against the tradition of Western Marxism and critical theory, for example, Lukács, Zonrato, Adorno, which in thematizing exchange, social synthesis, equalization, and real abstraction, conceptualized the opposite pole, as it were, to labor and production, and thus based their critique rather on the form of social exchange and mediation. Footnote. Labor theory of value is a term which Marx himself never used. Nevertheless, a left Ricardian interpretation was predominant both in the realm of classical Marxism and in that of critiques of classical Marxism. End footnote. What is enigmatic here, and this is what gives rise to the notorious, quote, money riddle, end quote, is that it is only through money that the relation between labors and the relations between commodities are constituted and realized in the first place. And yet, through this realization by money, these relations manifest themselves as if they existed independently of money, as if money were merely a neutral means of their representation. In short, these social relations are realized through money's quantification by measurement, as though they exist without money. This quantification by measurement has nothing to do with mere passive representation of an independently existing quality or relation, nor has it anything to do with counting, reduction, equation, or even with an abstraction, be it an abstraction from the qualitative dimension from the use values of commodities or from concrete labors. The strange entanglement which constitutes that which must seem to be independent also renders spurious the question as to whether money itself has value or only represents value. That is, whether money's value is based on a commodity with value, as is claimed by a metalist interpretation, or whether on the contrary value is conventional and ultimately imaginary, as is asserted by nominalists. And although the ambition in the following is to go with Marx beyond those oppositions in the concept of value in money, this means also going beyond his own ambivalences in this regard. All these discussions are redundant as they disregard the primary question, namely that as to how quantification is possible at all, that is, a quantification that appears like an objective self-reflection of the quantified relation. As will be shown, this quantification, which appears like a self-reflection, falls within the logic and technique of measure, and here money has the same fundamental constitutive status as measurement in natural science and especially in quantum physics. Footnote. Two other analogies to determine the technique of measure would be possible: Hegel's logic of being in his science of logic, and Alain Badiou's use of set theory in Being an Event in 2005. However, whereas measurement and quantification in natural science constitute a first nature, money constitutes a second purely social nature. Furthermore, the entanglement is reversed. Whereas the first nature is by means of the measured magnitudes actualized and reflected as an independent, given and unconscious relation opposed to society, money actualizes the same social relations which, through this very actualization, become real and possible as such. It is as if, through money, society enters into a super-individual, unconscious but practical reflection of its own second, quantitative nature in the first place, hence into itself. Section 4. How a measure and its object are given, the value form analysis and the constitution of social objectivity, bringing out the truth of finite being, the total unfolding and its conversion. By developing in a logical way how a measure is, quote, given, end quote, Marx's value form analysis shows how capitalist society, by turning social into quantitative relations, can exhibit its own relations as in a self-reflection. To show how money can constitute the same social self-relation that money simultaneously exhibits, Marx fully unfolds the simple form of value of an arbitrary commodity A, Z commodity A equals U commodity B, or V commodity C equals W commodity D, or X commodity E, or and so on, end quote, Marx. Yet this unfolding leads to a, quote, bad infinity, end quote, Hegel. There is a similar formulation in Marx of an infinite progress indicated in the and so on, or etc. The quote, and so on, etc. Without a final definitive conclusion, as one commodity must always determine and present that commodity's own social relations through another commodity, another different commodity, and ultimately every commodity has to be determined by that commodity's endless relation to all other commodities. No commodity can be finally determined, nowhere can no commodity can be finally determined, nowhere can the relation be determined as such and consummated in a final objective determination. The social relation can find the social relation's determination only in the social relation's own enduring endless progress without ever coming to a final determination. Yet instead of going endlessly further into this bad infinite relativity of an unresolvable relation, the analysis returns back to commodity A and turns the equation around and with the equation finitude itself. This turn, which is akin to a conversion, exposes the truth of the bad infinity, the quote, true infinity, end quote. In actual fact, it was the total unfolding itself that already brought out its own truth. As the total unfolding constructs a social relation in the first place, and hence the negative quality or pure being of a relation is such. But to demonstrate this truth, the becoming of this quality is necessarily accomplished by an inversion. It is only insofar as finitude is led through the form of finitude's own determination that the truth can be exhibited in one of its elements, commodity A. This commodity A, which stands for every individual commodity, can end the endless progress taking on the form, unfolding, vis-a-vis it, and it can hence be a, quote, general equivalent, end quote, of its own form determination. Moreover, it is an equivalent for the quality produced by this form. The relation is such pure being, or, and in fact all these mean the same, the negative quality or quality of negativity. Hence commodity A can be a universal equivalent for this quality of negativity by taking on the form not only of the determination of something by something else, of one commodity by another, but of the determination of the relation as such, that is, of the relation constituted as the identical being or negative quality opposed to it by the total unfolding of its own determination. In short, in commodity A, which stands for every single being, the bad infinity of the endless relation is considered to be speculatively completed and accomplished. It is as if, by returning to commodity A, the finitude in this one commodity returns to itself, but as if it were now totally and completely accomplished. Commodity A, having it completely passed through the form or logic to determine its own social relation, becomes, in striking analogy to the scenario of crucifixion, converted by its own infinity and universality, a universality which comes into being in this relation as the identical quality, or pure being as such, which is constituted by this form or logic. Converted in this way, commodity A is the, quote, universal equivalent, end quote, exposes all other commodities to the universal form or logic of their determination, and when they are related to their universal equivalent, commodities in turn become representatives of the determination they share through this equivalent, and yet commodities thereby become commodities in the first place, beings which can sublate their own social and, as will be shown, capitalist relation. Counting a relation as one, turning a negative being into the quality of quality. Quantity as the truth of quality. If one commodity can take on the pure relation of all commodities as such, that one commodity converts into the one commodity that counts the negative and identical quality of all other commodities as one. Therefore, commodity A becomes an equivalent not only for commodity A's own relation, but also for the negative identical quality which is constituted with this relation. And this means that the form to determine by relating, to determine something through another thing, becomes reflexive in an immediate and unconscious manner. The quality of determination becomes reflexive by turning a relation as such into a quantitative being. Thus commodities share their own relation, commodities' own negative being, and not only are commodities related as one to a common equivalent, thereby commodities also share this unity or oneness quantitatively. Counting itself as one and turning into quantitative being, this is how finitude, through one of its elements, can become reflexive and determine its own finitude purely as such. When the common relation of commodities is counted as one by a commodity which stands for the relation as such, this commodity represents an ideal, void and undetermined unit, determined to be determined by the relation, which it turns into a quantitative relation. thereby exhibiting its truth in quanta. The, quote, truth, end quote, exhibited is this turning of social into quantitative relations, exhibiting the negativity of their social being through the positivity of quanta. New section. The fixing of an ideal unit as the measure of value, the permanent exclusion of one commodity from all others. The form of a universal equivalent can be, quote, assumed by any commodity, end quote. But to be in this decisive universal position, the position of sovereignty, to use a term of political theology, one single commodity has to be permanently, quote, excluded from the rest, end quote. Marx refers to logical exclusion and to practical exclusion. It's through this exclusion that both sides in one stroke take on a totally new status. The universal equivalent fixes an ideal unit of value, and by this fixing the excluded commodity becomes the, quote, money commodity, end quote, while the other commodities in turn become its object and are set in a quantitative relation as pure values, thereby becoming commodities in the first place. It is only by virtue of its permanent excluded position that the money commodity fixes an ideal unit. Money itself is nothing, but money is absolutely necessary. Money itself is nothing, but it is absolutely necessary that something, an arbitrary being, exists in this excluded position, and it stands in for what is not to be found in all beings. An ideal unit and a measure to exhibit the truth of the relation, which becomes the object by turning into a quantitative being. Nothing, no being can, and nothing has to, be adequate to this ideal unit, since money becomes adequate to its negatively. As the analysis has shown, if the bad commodity is speculatively posited as accomplished in one commodity, in this commodity the logic of determination becomes reflexive and the commodity can turn into a universal equivalent. And through that commodity's permanent exclusion from this equivalent, and through this commodity's permanent exclusion, this equivalent fixes an ideal unit that counts the whole relation at one and turns it into a quantitative being. Footnote. The position of money and its status for the economy which it activates can be seen to be analogous to the position and status of the figures of sovereignty in religious and political power. Negative theology, especially in the tradition of Heidegger, Benjamin, Schmidt, Foucault, Agamben, and so on, also revolves around the excluded position of a sovereign who occupies the void, that is, the empty locus of power, especially the power to mark and make differences. Apophatic theology, also known as negative theology, is a form of theological thinking and religious practice which attempts to approach God, the divine, by negation, to speak only in terms of what may not be said about the perfect goodness that is God. It forms a pair together with cataphatic theology that approaches God or the divine by affirmations or positive statements about what God is. The apophatic tradition is often, though not always, allied with the approach of mysticism, which aims at the vision of God, the perception of the divine reality beyond the realm of ordinary perception. End footnote. Back to the text, end footnote. Although money always exists not only as some particular being, gold, paper money, electronic impulse, crypto code, but also as an already finite quantum, a, quote, scarce good, end quote. Logically, money stands for an undetermined unit of value, which acquires its own quantitative determination and specification through the economy it realizes, mediates and converts, as will be shown in the next section, retracing the development of Marx's Capital. To understand this logic of the measure, it is crucial also to understand the status of the analysis. The value form analysis concerns neither a historical nor a logical genesis of money. What is analyzed is a genesis that never occurred, yet it must seem as if the genesis becomes true by virtue of being always already assumed, and put into effect by the validity of money. It is only from an already given validity of money that this quantitative relation and this quantitative relation's pure validity can be reconstructed. But this reconstruction is necessary only because of money's own, quote, lost cause, end quote. Instead of leading to its historical or logical origins, such a reconstruction only leads to the non-derivability of money's validity. Money is a common equivalent for a form that never occurred. The form is always already in the state of having been replaced. Since in place of the necessity of determining every commodity by its relation to all other commodities, in money this bad infinity of a total relation is merely posited as accomplished, and as having been, quote, taken over, end quote, by money's validity. Therefore all commodities can enter into their social being by sharing it purely quantitatively right from the outset. In short, the genesis of money becomes true by virtue of its validity. This validity is pure and timeless, just like the quality that money realizes quantitatively. Yet it follows that money has to realize its own genesis together with this quantitative realization. The task of this analysis, hence, is to reveal the measure of the common excluded third already presented in X and Y, but as its vanished condition. That is also the reason why the analysis describes a non-linear and non-chronological genesis. That which is analyzed is the blind spot of quantification, the absent measuring unit that presents social being in an always already quantitative way by means of determined magnitudes. The whole quandary of the reconstruction of money's genesis can be captured in one term. Through its turn into quantitative relations, the social relation presents itself as reflected. That the quantitative finitude or being is always already reflected is the truth which money exhibits in, or more immediately with, the values it realizes. That these reflected magnitudes become reflexive in a self-relation will be the truth of money's own turnover as capital. Quantity is the quality of a relation that can become reflexive as such, that is, as a relation and hence as a negative being or negative quality. The measure is the means for this reflexivity. The reflection carried out by money is as unconscious as it is objective. It occurs as a self-reflection, and is this self-reflection that, through money, is given to the subject qua objectivity in realized values. With money, therefore, what the subject is given is the means to turn the social relations of things into objectivity that presents itself in that objectivity's quantitative being in an already reflected way. To enter into this relation, the measure, quote, merely, end quote, has to be used as a means of social mediation. One second. New section. Money as a means and the necessary false semblance, exchange and circulation as measurement. So far the analysis is only shown in a purely logical categorical way how, through the exclusion of a money commodity, an ideal unit becomes fixed and the logic of quantification is given by a measure. However, the realization of the ideal unit which money as a measure stands for has yet to acquire its function as a means of, quote, exchange, end quote, and its function in the, quote, circulation of commodities, end quote, as the ideal unit becomes real through the actualization of commodities as values. Marx describes this actualization immediately after the value form analysis in chapters 2 and 3 of Capital. While the value form analysis is a purely logical categorical status, the commodity circulation process describes a practical social relation, and its exposition is at the same time its critique, as circulation produces a necessary false semblance. The critique has two facets. Just like exchange, circulation, and social mediation itself have an ambiguous status between money as a measure of value and money as the capitalist form of its value valorization. The first facet is the previous analysis, which shows that an exchange and circulation process of quantitative values presupposes a fixed common measure and therefore must turn out to be something else. What seems to be merely an exchange of money against a commodity is in fact a form of measurement. And the other facet, which will be developed in the section following this one, is the measured and objectified, quote, object, is that the measured and objectified, quote, object, end quote, is not, as it seems, the relation of commodities, but rather the relations which obtain in their production. What initially regards the presupposed measure, in the exchange process, the logical status of an excluded money commodity becomes practical. Hence, the realization of the ideal unit by the quantification of the relation of the commodities also becomes practical. Whereas in the analysis, the exclusion of the money commodity and the fixing of an ideal unit was shown only logically. In the circulation process, money enters into practice into the same mediation of commodities from which money falls out, more drastically in the so-called Grundrisse, Marx. With its practical exclusion of the money commodity, the circulation process is, so to say, an ongoing repetition of the origin of the money commodity and the money commodity's position and status. Or, more accurately, both money and commodities practically enter into mediation and circulation and fall out of mediation and circulation. But while commodities fall out of circulation to disappear in consumption, money which mediates this process not only determines and presents this mediation in the values realized, but money also divides this mediation in time and space into the act of buying and selling. While money holds the realized values identical in time and space in a determinate way by transferring and circulating values. This is why the ideal unit, fixed by the excluded money commodity as a measure of value, not only becomes real through all the acts of selling and buying, and through all the values realized and transferred, that is, by the process executed by money as a means, the ideal unit thereby also takes on a form, the form, quote, of simple circulation, end quote, commodity, money, commodity. Moreover, by taking on the form of commodity and money, value becomes a, quote, automatic subjectivity, end quote, by being simultaneously the objectivity of social being. Footnote. Much more Hegelian is the German version of Capital, Volume 1, where Marx also refers to a, quote, übergreifendes Subjekt, overarching subject, and, quote, Identität mit sich selbst, end quote, identity with itself. The English version of Capital has fewer Hegelian terms, and in the French version, quote, subject, end quote, is replaced by, quote, substance, end quote. End footnote. This is how, of all things, the ideality of the fixed unit becomes the materialism, as it were, to realize. It says materialism, but that seems weird. This is how, of all things, the identity of the fixed unit becomes the materialism, as it were. I think it means the material. I don't know. To realize and present the finitude in the finitude's hardest and purest, most objective and immediate mode, a pure quanta. However, money presents this objective reality only in money's passing and vanishing. Moreover, this objective present reality is a false immediacy and a necessary semblance. Although, unlike the value form analysis before, money, value, and commodities are now situated in a chronological and linear social mediation. What money now presents in these values of commodities is already an actualization of the relations in these commodities' production. Did I read that wrong? Although, unlike the value form analysis before, money, value, and commodities are now situated in a chronological and linear social mediation. What money now presents in these values of commodities is already an actualization of the relations in their production, and through this actualization, money gives the possible future a quantitatively determined reality. The values realized define and open up this future, and money is this passage between realized past and the realized past possible future. This leads to the other aforementioned facet of Marx's critique of mediation as a necessary false semblance. Section 6. The capital form of money, money commodity, money prime, the self-realization of money by means of the self-valorization of value, capitalism's self-measurement. Quote, the whole difficulty arises from the fact that commodities are not exchanged simply as commodities, but as products of capitals, end quote. Marx. Marx's Capital demonstrates that the ideal unit for which money, as a measure, stands not only becomes a means which posits all commodities in a social relation that commodities quantitatively share. Money thereby also posits in a relation the elements of the production of commodities, labor and capital. Money posits all private and isolated concrete labors and all individual capitals, at least in the respective branches of commodity production, in a relation by constructing a totality of all labor time spent and all individual capitals used, and by this, money simultaneously deduces average magnitudes. What therefore seems to be an exchange process is not only a form of measurement. Likewise, the measured and objectified, quote, object, end quote, consists not of commodities, but rather of the valorization accomplished by labor power and capital in labor power and capital's production process. I misread that. What therefore seems to be an exchange process is not only a form of measurement. Likewise, the measured and objectified, quote, object, end quote, consists not of commodities, but rather of the valorization accomplished by labor power and capital in those commodities production process. In short, quote, to measure, end quote, means to sell all labors and all capitals in a common, or even global, relation and to deduce simultaneously the average magnitudes necessary for their productive valorization. What Marx therefore develops as, quote, abstract labor, end quote, and calls the, quote, substance of value, end quote, is labor power valorized by capital and set in a social relation, measured and quantified by money. But the crucial point has still not been reached yet, since paradoxically, measuring money and the values money realizes will be reconverted into, and thus returned back to, these elements of commodity production which have been actualized by money. As a measure of value and means of its valorization, money opens up its own self-relation through capitalist valorization. Marx describes this metamorphosis as the, quote, capital form, end quote, money commodity money, which with a profit, money commodity money prime, where commodity, or C, capital C, stands for labor power and capitalist means of production. Hence, what money and capitalism posits in a quantitative status is not only commodities, but also producers, and the producers' means of production, which take on the historically new status as labor power and capital, and thus are commodified as well. Marx shows this new status at the end of Capital Volume 1, in the chapter so-called primitive accumulation, and thereby traces an arc to its beginning by showing the historical and logical origins of the valorization process that he had developed throughout Capital Volume 1. However, this development has revealed that, through its capitalist form, money must, as in a reproduction of this origin of accumulation, again and again activate the same elements of valorization, which are encompassed in overarching fashion by its own capitalist metamorphosis. Likewise, the exposition has demonstrated that money internalizes, by means of the values realized, what money's own externalization and into these elements has been worth. Thereby, the social objectivity for which money seems to be the means of mediation dissolves into a process in which money, in order to reproduce money's capitalist functions, money's pure and universal validity, money's own economic value, sorry, I'm confusing myself here. I'm having trouble following the pronouns. Thereby, the social objectivity for which money seems to be the means of mediation dissolves into a process in which money, in order to reproduce money's capitalist functions, money's pure and universal validity, and money's own economic value, has to externalize this value into elements which have to be released into the independence of their valorization. During this independent valorization, all the different kinds of labor and individual capital quantitatively share the same common social being, to which the different kinds of labor and individual capital contribute, but to which they contribute only in a speculative way, while money becomes their overarching form, being the actualization of their quantitative being and becoming the actual identity of their process. This is why Capital Volume 1 finally demonstrates that the ideal unit of value becomes real not only through the exclusion of a money commodity, which functions as a measure and becomes the means for the realization and mediation of quanta, to exist. This ideal unit of value must be split by money's overarching capital form and capital process into the forms of labor power and capital. Section 7, new section. The measurement of productivity, specification of money through the construction of average magnitudes, of necessary labor time, and profit. The entanglement between money and value has to be developed in order to generate, on the one hand, the capital form of money, and on the other hand, the valorization of value by labor and capital, and their entanglement itself has to be developed as a measurement, although Marx himself does not speak of measurement, but rather of a, quote, complicated social process, end quote, and of the, quote, transformation, end quote, of values into prices. What seems, however, to be a transformation in time and in space, leading to the notorious, quote, transformation problem, end quote, is again not a chronological linear, not a causal and not an arithmetic calculation, and many of the misunderstandings to which Marx himself gave rise are due to the arithmetic calculations Marx presents in a manner resembling a left Ricardian objective labor theory of value. What do occur in chronological time and in space, however, are all the, quote, decisions, end quote, made when money breaks and interrupts a processing relation with a measurement which brings this process to a quantitative determination by prices. That which is, quote, transformed, end quote, by its measurement is the status of the relation, namely from a not yet determined social relation, valorization of value, which through prices becomes quantitatively determined, fixed and made manifest. Money's essence is is to make value manifest as price, but also to dissolve these prices. This manifestation of social being back into social relations, this manifestation of value as price, is the reason why it appears as if value were quantitatively traceable or reconstructible. Marx indeed attempted such a quantitative reconstruction in Capital. What therefore seems to be money's essence, namely the exchanging of commodities and the realization of values, is rather to be taken as the moment of this decision and determination of our social relation qua measurement, a timeless and spaceless interruption, which is the necessary passage to determine and continue society's self-relation, and its endless processing and accumulation by means of finite, determinate, and regulative quanta. Yet nor is this passage a transformation in time and in space, as if both were given as per classical Newtonian physics. It is, rather, a transformation of time and space themselves, as money literally brings the same time with itself, which it quantitatively realizes, transfers, and converts, thereby defining the chronological and the spatial dimension of social relations. By actualizing values, money interrupts a valorization, which is functioning as a process, and spatially dispersed in the totality of capitalist relations. And by means of this break and interruption, a realized past which is actualized by magnitudes becomes separated from, but is also rendered regulative for, its own further, future productive valorization. Not only is measurement by money the separation between the realized past and its future, but money is also the means to convert these magnitudes back into its functioning as a process, becoming the passage between the past and future of valorization. In short, quantification by measurement is a passage for both, a spatialization of time and space, and a temporalization of space and time. It is therefore impossible to quantitatively reconstruct or calculate values from prices, as individual prices necessarily lead back to this process of the measurement of a relation of labor power and capitalist means and conditions, which is in process and not quantitatively fixed. Economic science, like everyday consciousness, has no concept for this indeterminacy. Yet neither do economic science and everyday consciousness have any need for such a concept, since money is the technique which can literally induce value, as a quantitatively indeterminate relation, to become manifest in a quantitatively determinate way in the prices of individual things. Money therefore allows economic science and economic subjects a calculation with prices only, a calculation in which prices lead back to prices, and the indeterminacy, quote, in between, end quote, is resolved by the negative essence of money. Footnote. Although Marx often presents labor time and values as if labor time and values are already quantified, Marx nevertheless emphasizes, especially in Volume 3, that the quantitative existence of this social relation is only price, hence monetarily determined value. While mainstream political economy calculates with prices only and regards, quote, value as metaphysical, critique has to start with the difference of value and price to reconstruct the social mediation, which literally vanishes by means of its own manifestation. Marx's critique is not only located within this distinction, it is also his criterion for distinguishing, quote, classical, end quote, from a, quote, vulgar economy, end quote, afterward and in particular. End footnote. Nevertheless, only capitalism, which comprises a measurement which functions like a practical reflection and decision, opens up this difference between value and price, a difference which entails nothing less than social mediation in its totality, or as totality. Money makes value manifest in prices and makes value disappear. The difference also becomes the critical distinction as such, and opens up the problem of a, quote, transformation, end quote, between value and price. It is only in capitalism that money, in money's functions and money's capitalist movement, 1, individualizes the same labor powers and capitals that money sets in a common relation. 2, making their relation manifest in a quantitative, determinate way in individual prices. In 3, a way that all labors and all capitals quantitatively share the same valorization process to which they contribute. While 4, money from past valorization determines and deduces the average socially necessary magnitudes of labor time and of profit decisive for their future productive valorization for, quote, socially necessary labor time, end quote, for the, quote, average profit, end quote. In short, in capitalism, the socialization of labor, of capital in all things, is accomplished by this quantification and measuring process, and the ideal value unit, for which the excluded money commodity stands, is for its part, the ideal value unit, its part, quantitatively specified, and as it were, socialized by the measurement of the results of the valorization process and the measured magnitudes. Money is always a finite quantum, quantitatively specified by the measurement money enacts through money's own metamorphosis as capital, and by the magnitudes it realizes, converts, and transfers. Section 8. The entanglement, the interference of money's functions, and the superposition of value. The character of a measurement is captured in the correspondence between the magnitudes money actualizes, transfers, and converts on the one hand, and money's own value and quantitative specification on the other. Although Marx develops the single functions of money in a linear way, in the capitalist process these functions overlap each other and interfere, and it is because they are entangled with a value, which likewise has different conditions or statuses according to these different functions. Marx's development of money and value hence requires more than the dialectical understanding shown so far. We have to grasp that money's functions interfere with each other, and that value, our very own, quote, social relation, end quote, exists in a kind of, quote, superposition, end quote, to conceptualize it with a post-Newtonian quantum physics, which Marx could not yet make use of. Just 1 second. First, I'm going to look up okay, that's too much for me to read. I don't know how to fucking I'm looking at quantum quantum superposition. There's a term in quantum mechanics. So I'll read what quantum mechanics is, because I'm not an expert in fucking science by any means. I'm a fucking dumbass. They have one for dum-dums. Introduction to Quantum Mechanics. There we are. Quantum mechanics is the study of matter and matter's interactions with energy on the scale of atomic and subatomic particles, By contrast, classical physics explains matter and energy only on a scale familiar to human experience, including the behavior of astronomical bodies such as the moon. Classical physics is still used in much of modern science and technology. However, towards the end of the 19th century, scientists discovered phenomena in both the large macro and in the small micro worlds that classical physics could not explain. The desire to resolve inconsistencies between observed phenomenon and classical theory led to a revolution in physics, a shift in the original scientific paradigm, the development of quantum mechanics. Many aspects of quantum mechanics are counterintuitive and can seem paradoxical because they describe behavior quite different from that seen at larger scales. In the words of quantum physicist Richard Feynman, quantum mechanics deals with, quote, nature as nature is, absurd, end quote. Features of quantum mechanics often defy simple explanations in everyday language. One example of this is the uncertainty principle. Precise measurements of position cannot be combined with precise measurements of velocity. Another example is entanglement. In certain circumstances, two particles with a shared history may become mutually, quote, entangled, end quote, in which case a measurement made on one particle, such as an electron that is measured to have spin up, will be statistically correlated with the outcome of an equivalent measurement on the other particle, that the other will be more likely to be found to have spin down. This applies even though the particles may be so far apart that it is impossible for the result of the first measurement to have been transmitted to the second particle before the second measurement takes place. Quantum mechanics helps us understand chemistry because quantum mechanics explains how atoms interact with each other and form molecules. Many remarkable phenomena can be explained using quantum mechanics, like superfluidity. Like helium in a container, cooler in a temperature near absolute zero, spontaneously flows up and over the rim of its container, an effect which cannot be explained by classical physics. Now I'll read the more sophisticated one. Quantum mechanics is a fundamental theory in physics that describes the behavior of nature at and below the scale of atoms. Quantum mechanics is the foundation of all quantum physics, which includes quantum chemistry, quantum field theory, quantum technology, and quantum information science. Quantum mechanics can describe many systems that classical physics cannot. Classical physics can describe many aspects of the nature at an ordinary macroscopic and optical microscopic scale, but it is not sufficient for describing those aspects of nature in very small submicroscopic atomic and subatomic scales. Most theories in classical physics can be derived from quantum mechanics as an approximation valid at large macroscopic/microscopic scale. Quantum systems have bound states that are quantized to discrete values of energy, momentum, angular momentum, and other quantities. In contrast to classical systems where these quantities can be measured continuously, measurements of quantum systems show characteristics of both particles and waves, wave-particle duality, and there are limits to how accurately the value of a physical quantity can be predicted prior to its measurement, given a complete set of initial conditions, the uncertainty principle. Quantum mechanics arose gradually from theories to explain observations that could not be reconciled with classical physics, such as Max Planck's solution in 1900 to the black-body radiation problem and the correspondence between energy and frequency in Albert Einstein's 1905 paper, which explained the photoelectric effect. These early attempts to understand the microscopic phenomena, now known as the, quote, old quantum theory, end quote, led to the full development of quantum mechanics in the mid-1920s by Niels Bohr, Erwin Schrödinger, Werner Heisenberg, Max Born, Paul Dirac, and others. The modern theory is formulated in various specifically developed mathematical formalisms. In one of them, a mathematical entity called the wave function provides information in the form of probability amplitudes about what measurements of a particle's energy, momentum, and other physical properties may yield. So that's what quantum mechanics is. And so back to the text. First, with regard to money's overlapping functions, money's logically first function as a measure only comes into being by the exclusion of one commodity, which fixes an ideal unit and becomes the, quote, money commodity, end quote. This unit, however, only becomes a measure of value through money's function as a means of the actualization and mediation of value in the form of what seem to be commodity exchanges. And finally, both the measure of value and the means of value's realization always already actualize and extrapolate money's own self-reference as capital in the values of commodities, making exchange value a necessary false semblance. It is only in capitalism that money, as a medium of exchange and circulation, measures the results of a valorization into which money itself was converted and from which money returns, closing the circle of money's self-reference by arcing across the elements of the independent valorization process, labor, power, and the means and conditions of production. Second, the overlapping of money's function is entangled with a corresponding different status of value. As a measure, money, whichever shape it might take as a money commodity, and in whatever quantity and value it exists, stands in the last instance for an ideal unit of value that is completely indefinite, and at the same time universally valid. As a medium of exchange, money realizes this unity, always already through finite quantitatively determinate values, and thereby the ideal unit always already exists in single quanta, taking on the form of commodity circulation. But as capital, money has to split and metamorphose the ideal unit for which it stands and which it realizes, by converting these realized values back into the elements of their valorization. To summarize, the ideality and unity of the ideal unit of value becomes real only, 1, by being represented and fixed, money as measure, 2, by means of by being disseminated into the relation of beings and beings' mediation, money as means, and 3, by being split in the overarching self-relation, which is in process, in the forms of labor, power, and capital, money's capital form. This entanglement is why money's own value must correspond to that which, on the side of the economy, it realizes, transfers, and converts. Money is nothing but a quantum, specified by its own processing in the forms of the economy. However, one big riddle is still open. How can this necessity of a correspondence, this entanglement between measure and measured relations, quantitatively transcend itself and enlarge its own process and its reproduction? New section. Exploitation of time by time's quantification. This is section 9. The self-measurement of valorization in money's self-relation as capital contains the riddle of how this self-measurement can overcome this self-measurement's self. The quantification of labor and capital and the measurement of their valorization, qua its results, leaves, or, more accurately, yields, a quantitative surplus, marked in the dash in the capital form, money, commodity, money prime. Moreover, the whole entanglement is a priori, oriented to the increase of both value and money, and this quantitative accumulation not only has to take on qualitative forms in labor power, its means of production, and in the commodities produced. The latter are all constantly modified, developed and even revolutionized qualitatively by the necessity to go beyond themselves quantitatively. In order to understand the emergence of this surplus, the entanglement of valorization in capital form has to be once again understood as a self-measurement. Thus far, the accumulation of capital has been an infinite and immeasurable valorization process beyond all measures, precisely because the relations are constantly measured and the measured values not only determine the necessary magnitudes for a productive valorization of labor power and capital, but also these magnitudes are transferred and converted into them by the measuring unit of which money stands. However, money also literally brings out or extracts an excessive dimension. Without money, a surplus value is exploited and receives an independent existence in a pure quantum. Only money can extract a surplus value which, according to Marx, is labor time, which goes beyond the labor time necessary for the reproduction of the commodity labor power, which the worker receives as a wage. Only money can realize this difference between the value produced by labor and the value of the commodity labor power itself, by quantitatively realizing this difference, and as it were, extracting it as profit. Only money can convert this exploited surplus time back into the valorization process, because only money can convert this exploited surplus labor time back into the valorization process it came from. And finally, or rather, first of all, it is only in money that it pays off for capitalist society to increase productivity by reducing labor time and the reproduction costs of the commodity labor power, in order to convert the reduced labor time and the reduced reproduction costs into surplus labor time. The two methods for this conversion are described in Marx. This is Capital. Marx's Capital. Page 317 to 534. Outside of money, this surplus time can exist only in a spatial dimension. Like time relations in general, this excess dimension of time must take on the forms of labor power, capitalist means and conditions of production, and commodities, and it must fall within their spatial reproduction circuits. Meanwhile, only money can, quote, translate, end quote, these spatial forms and reproduction circuits into time by quantifying them, giving the excess surplus labor time an independent existence. Final section, section 10, conclusion. The translation of measurement and quantification into a, quote, economy of time, end quote. The next step would be to transfer both the technique of money and the valorization of labor power and capital, hence both the measuring, quote, subject and the measured object or substance, into a, quote, economy of time, end quote, and literally to dissolve their entanglement in time. Footnote. There have been several attempts to reconstruct such an economy of time. For example, Jacques Derrida, Moïse Pastone, Daniel Ben Said, can't remember his first name, but S. Tambazos, P. Osborne, David Harvey, Werner Bonafelt, Massimiliano Tamba, H. Rosa, J. Martineau, and H. Harutunian. However, even where the connection between economy and time was sought in money, it was mostly determined in a rather, quote, exoteric way, whereas the, quote, esoteric, end quote, connection has, in my view, to be sought in quantification and measurement. That esoteric distinction, I think, is an important one that comes from value critique, which is different from value form analysis. Value critique being associated with people like what is his name? Robert Kurz, Norbert, I think it's Norbert Trinkel, Ernest Lohoff, Anselm Joppa, something like Roswitha Schultz or something like that. I can't remember her name, but like people from the journals Crisis and Exit, I believe like to use those terms, esoteric and exoteric, in referring to like the Marx's very high level of abstraction. Anyway, money. Back to the text. Money, with the ideal unit it stands for, and with the relations money quantitatively realizes, mediates and converts, calculates or reckons with the identity of time. Yet this time must obtain in the forms and in the relations of labor power and its capitalist means and conditions of reproduction. As regards the dimension of valorization, Marx explicitly dissolves the substance of value and values valorization into two temporal relationships, or rather, Marx shows that it is the capitalist self-relation of money which dissolves into these two time relations. The first relation is present and past labor time, contained in labor power and accumulated in the value of the capitalist means of production. Marx develops this relation under the term, quote, organic composition of capital, end quote. The second relation is necessary in surplus labor time. Through this relation, time becomes excessive through the commodification of labor time and the reproduction circuit of this particular, quote, ecstatic, end quote, commodity. What is measured and exhibited in average magnitudes of labor time, but also in profit, is in the last instance the actual productive power of these two time relations. The technique of putting into effect and regulating these time relations falls within a measurement and a quantification that can now be summarized and epitomized as a calculation, or a reckoning, with the identity of time. This calculation is twofold and ambivalent. It is a rational and even a mathematical calculation executed with money by all individuals. However, these are always already moments of the super-individual, speculative calculation which money puts into effect when it posits all the qualitative forms of labor and capital in a social relation, which they quantitatively share by means of the construction of the average magnitudes necessary for their own productive valorization and reproduction. Furthermore, money is this metamorphosis and this passage between past and future valorization. The individual calculation must therefore, in a second-order operation as it were, reckon with this super-individual reckoning which money puts into effect for the capitalist totality and for individuality. To recapitulate this reckoning, the main functions of money must be translated or transposed into the technique of measurement through time. 1. As a measure, the excluded money commodity, with the fixed ideal unit of value, holds time identical or timeless. The negative and identical quality which emerges through quantification by a measure, hence the quality of quantitative relations, seems to be an abstract homogeneous time which exists timelessly by virtue of its quantification. 2. Through this quantification, however, this timeless self-identical time always already comes into being via the magnitudes of commodities. It thereby exists in a determinate and finite way, and it seems that money qua means of exchange and circulation realizes and presents this time by quantifying it, and that money holds time as quantitatively identical and stores it by transferring and circulating it. 3. Yet this presence of time is also a semblance, as money realizes in the magnitudes of commodities the productive power of the time relations which regulate those commodities' production, that is, the productive power of living present and past dead but accumulated labor time. This quantitative realization turns out to be an actualization of the productive power of the relation of past and present labor time by average magnitudes, just as if this relation had been measured through time. Although money stands for a negative pure and universal time, this becomes regulated by means of the average magnitudes which money deduces, determining from past valorization the magnitudes necessary for future productive relations and for future, quote, organic compositions, unquote, of past and present labor time, and money itself converts these magnitudes back into these relations, becoming the passage of a present between past and future presents. 4. Whereas the capital form brings into effect a productive relation of past and present labor time, and encompasses it in an overarching manner, as in the time-spanning movement, the finance forms of capital calculate with the future of this relation, and deal with different possibilities which turn into probabilities, and entangle the present with its anticipated future. To summarize, in the quanta actualized, money makes the valorization of labor power through capital manifest as if the relation between these two were measured through time. Through money's functions and circuits, society as a whole is held to be the measure of time, and becomes fractured by time as in a total self-reflection, and in a reflection of social totality. On the one hand, this time comes to exist in all the measured and quantified social relations which, on the other hand, are constantly realized, transferred, and converted by money. The entanglement between measured valorization and measuring money is an entanglement between, on the one hand, a detached and external or natural, better naturalized time, which at once becomes socialized by the valorization of labor and capital, and on the other hand, it measures through money, making money the interface between naturalized and socialized time. This is how, finally, both money and measured valorization dissolve their entanglement in a temporalization of time. This dissolution of social relations in time is simultaneously the solution of the money riddle. Money quantitatively realizes a time which money itself brings with it. Money is this temporalization of time by quantifying social relations, reckoning with the identity of a time which becomes the identity of society in the circuits of society's reproduction. Citation. The end. Thanks for listening. I'm going to read the citations now, or the references. We have Bachhaus's On Dialectics of the Value Form from Thesis 11, that's from 1980. Alain Badiou's Being and Event from 2005. Friedrich Engels' 1859 Review of a Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in Marx Engels Collected Works, Volume 16. Friedrich Engels, 1894, Preface to Volume 3, in Marx Engels Collected Work, Volume 37. Frank Engster, the author of this piece. Apparently this is a huge book. This is like a 800-page tome. Das Geld als Maß, Mittel und Methode, das Rechnen mit der Identität der Zeit. G.W.F. Hegel's The Science of Logic. Michael Heinrich, The Science of Value, Marx's Critique of Political Economy Between Scientific Revolution and Classical Tradition. Immanuel Kant, 1781, Critique of Puritanism. Karl Marx, Grundrisse Manuscripts 1857-61. Marx Manuscripts 1861-63. Marx Capital, Critique of Political Economy, Volume 1. Marx Das Kapital, Kritik der politischen Ökonomie. That's a German version. Karl Marx Capital, Volume 3, in Marx Engels Collected Work, Volume 37. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, Manifesto of the Communist Party, in Marx Engels Collected Works, Volume 6. Isaac Illich Rubin, Essays on Marx's Theory of Value. And that's it. So, thanks for listening.